also want to mention that one of the things that maybe we proved at this conference is that we can be as bad as environmentalists about gender balance at conferences. There's been a notable lack of women's in speaking roles throughout this conference, and we're not necessarily making up for it in this panel. But there has been some unfortunate. We invited a woman from PEG first, and that's the environmental, what's the name of that? Was it political ecology group, who was unable to come because the Sierra Club is having their big vote this weekend on immigration. And they're intimately involved in that challenge. And then we invited Sheila O'Donnell, as you know, who had to cancel at the last minute. In addition, on this panel, we're missing an important perspective, and that is from Janet Robidoux, who had agreed to be on this panel. She's a Native American organizer, urban Indian organizer, and we wanted that perspective up here. Unfortunately, she got called to the White House, and I don't know why she picked the president over us, but she did. There's some discussions around the lack of inclusion of Native Americans in President Clinton's discussions on race, his community forums, and he's invited a number of Indian leaders to discuss this with him, and Janet was one of those. So, having said that, let me talk just briefly about the people that are up here in front of you, so that you know who's here. Tarso Ramos, for those of you who were here last night, is the director of whatever at the Western State Center. The Wise Use Public Exposure Project. How's that?
That's excellent. Actually, you refer to it by both names, whatever, or Wise Use.
And I've asked him to moderate the panel, which I will discuss here briefly. Bryony Schwan is the director of Women's Voices for the Earth, and she's here on this panel specifically to represent the environmental constituency. The fact is, on the progressive movement, we tend to be kind of narrowly focused down these issues area. In fact, most of the people up here are quite generalists. They aren't necessarily narrowly focused folks, but we're assigning people to represent a particular constituency that they're familiar with. So Bryony will represent the environmental constituency. As I said, my name is Christine Coffin. I'm with the Human Rights Network, and I'm going to represent one sort of area of the Human Rights Networks, and that's gay and lesbian organizing. And just a comment on language here is, you're supposed to really say gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender movement. I find that uncomfortable and awkward, and so I'm going to use the word queer from time to time. And I know for some people that is an offensive sounding word, and just so you know that there is an effort to sort of reclaim that word, and it's used quite regularly by people who are members of that community, which I am. Judy Smith is a Missoula activist. We've asked her to represent organizing in the women's constituency, and that in itself is multifaceted or multi-issue. And Judy, of course, is involved in many other issues besides that. Peter Schober is a pastor at the University Congregational United Church of Christ. Is that right? And we've asked him to represent kind of a communities of faith sort of perspective in this panel about organizing. So having said all that, I'm going to ask Tarso to kind of set up the scene here, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Chris. What this panel is intended to do, among other things, is to kind of make real by giving a kind of a complex situation that we can all collectively grapple with some of the issues and dynamics that we've been focusing on in more specific or narrow ways over the course of this conference. So we're going to start out with quite a bit of engagement in sort of an active scenario, which I'm going to lay out for you in a moment by the panelists, and then eventually we'll be having some back and forth with everybody else in the room as well. So be prepared to participate. We look forward to that portion of this. The scenario that our panelists are going to be engaging with is as follows. Recently, a group called the Missoula Parents Committee has been raising the issue with the textbook selection for the high school English curriculum. Specifically, their concern is they say the textbook is teaching the false religion of transcendentalism by studying the works of Emerson and Thoreau. At the same time, many community members are also upset with school administration plans to close a neighborhood school. The school board is holding a public hearing on the curriculum issue in 4 weeks, a month out, and the Parents Committee is running 2 of their members for school board seats. That election is 6 weeks away. A new group in Missoula called People For something, People For, FOR, is trying to build a base of support for retaining the curriculum, exposing the right-wing activism behind this grassroots parents group, so-called grassroots parents group, and electing progressive candidates to the school board. It is apparent that the core of activists in the curriculum fight, that is, with the Missoula Parents Committee, are the same people who have been involved in other community actions. In the past year, and under a variety of different group names, they have picketed the women's clinic with signs calling for God's punishment on abortion providers. A week later, the clinic was firebombed. Disrupted installed efforts to implement a comprehensive land use county plan. Signed a right-to-work petition during the last legislature. Testified in favor of Conrad Burns' proposal to limit tribal sovereignty. Signed anti-queer letters to the editor and called for the city commission to stop the Pride March because God hates fags, in their words. And they've opposed a middle school diversity curriculum focused on Native Americans because it also called for support of gay families. So this new organization, People For, is asking you, in this case, we're going to start with you, Brian, you representing the Greens in the community, to bring your activist base together with them and other progressive groups in an effort to retain the curriculum that's under attack. So you represent a Green organization in Missoula, and these, for the time being, are some members of your organization. And the question to you is, would you join this effort that's been requested, and why or why not to make that decision? And then we're going to hear a little bit from your constituents at the table.
All right. I would, as the director of an environmental organization, I would definitely join this coalition. And I'm not speaking actually just doing a play role here, I really would, as the director of Women's Voices for the Earth. For a number of reasons, because I think, as has been clearly pointed out in this conference, that it's the same people behind this whole series of events that Tarso listed that are, creating these little pockets of opposition to a progressive agenda on many different fronts. And so that just because they rear their head at a school board issue, curriculum issue, doesn't mean that you need to not take a narrow view and say, well, what's this got to do with environmentalism or the environmental issues that you may be specifically working on at the time. The fact is that it's all connected. The other reason that I would join is because I believe that the progressive movement cannot win any of its issues alone, and that we need to start working together to address these issues. The other reason that I would join is that if we cannot protect education and a free education, freedom within the educational curriculum, then we are going to have a much bigger problem. I mean, after all, this is the generation that will be informing the next generation and the next leaders that come up, and therefore it's critical that they have a decent education. And the fourth reason I would join is that I really believe that the environmental issues are connected to every other issue, not just in this case as we see the opposition, but the reality is, and I want to refer to some of Tasha's comments last night when you mentioned that it is the responsibility of environmentalists when you're going into communities where there has been natural resource depletion, where you've got a mine closing or a mill that's closed, to take an active role in economic development. Because I believe that the environment does not exist in isolation of other things. You cannot address the environmental problems without addressing things like poverty, without addressing things like women's rights. These are all interconnected. And so that's the reason why I joined.
I would just ask, as a board member, I actually am on Brian's board. In January we did a strategic plan. We're looking down the road 3, 4, 5 years, and I don't think that working on school board curriculum was anywhere in that plan. And I guess just sort of the practical question, you know, we've got a bunch of campaigns, we're concerned about toxics, pesticides, et cetera. Simply a matter of resources and energy. And, you know, you have a certain number of volunteers, a certain amount of volunteer activism you can count on. And if you're setting people up to fight in the school curriculum arena, aren't you taking your resources away from somewhere else?
Well, you may be temporarily taking your resources away from somewhere else, but I think we've got to stop looking at issues in such a narrow window by saying, my goal is to stop this mine or work on this particular campaign. We've got to take a broader vision of it, because ultimately we won't win the specific goals that we're dealing with anyway if we continue to work in isolation and stop seeing and we don't see the broader connection of this. So even though, yes, this takes resources away, I really believe that unless we connect it into the broader vision, and you can't, I mean, you can plan to a certain extent, but you also have to be able to respond. And I believe that, you know, the same people that may be working on the school curriculum are going to be the same people that will be, for instance, going into the Lincoln community where the Blackfoot mine is, and convincing those people that the only way that they need the mine because they need that economic development.
Does anybody else, or any of your other constituents, imagine problems with this?
Okay, my imagined problem, to be the devil's advocate, would be to lift up the reality that when all these curriculum meetings are going to be happening is when we've also, you know, already said that we will be present at some direct action on a clear environmental issue. So if we are to encourage our people to be of assistance on a broader issue, we're going to dissipate our own focus. So what do you do with that?
Well, I think that, you know, that comes up quite a lot, because you've got a limited number of resources. But the thing is that you don't have to drop what you're doing. You don't have to drop the campaigns that you're working on now. You may be able to join this coalition and offer assistance. Maybe you can't go to the specific hearing, but you could offer assistance by writing a story about it in your newsletter and educating your own constituents about the particular issue and what's behind it, so that it doesn't take away from the specific, the direct action that's planned at the time. So even though your level of energy may not, on this particular issue, may not equal your level of energy on other projects, I think it's still important that you educate your own constituency and make them see the connections.
And maybe as a volunteer member, I would say, well, I really joined LEAD because I thought there was this particular focus on women's issues in the environment, and that's how I want to spend my time. And I'm very concerned that all of a sudden this organization that I joined for those reasons is off doing this wide range of other things, and I want to see us focus back on the things that I joined for because I thought they were so important.
Well, they are important, but again, I think that, you know, women's issues are clearly connected into the school board curriculum, because the same kinds of people who are going to be going after Emerson and Thoreau and saying it's a form of transcendentalism probably have very poor views and do have very poor views on women's role, and will do anything they can to suppress women being active participants in their community. So I think it's directly tied to that, and I don't think it will take away from our specific goal of getting women involved in environmental issues.
It's kind of hard for me to have this argument with you.
I know it's kind of hard for me to see you, Judy, so that
We are going to open this up and let you all talk here after we...
We'll come back to this, but Chris, you're representing, at least for this case, a queer organization, and you've been asked to join in this fight as well, and how are you going to answer that?
Well, I would also answer with a resounding yes. I think there's very clear self-interest here for gay and lesbian people to be involved in this activity. First of all, once again, it's the same activists. You can tell by the language they're using in previous fights. They're the same activists. They're going to try to stop the Pride March through Missoula, which, by the way, is June 12th. And so it's the same issue of the, you know, the activists are overlapping, their agenda is broad. curriculum issues particularly often will revolve around trying to keep some sort of, quote, gay agenda out of the schools. There's a lot of language around that. You will hardly ever hear some kind of a school fight issue that doesn't bring up this issue that somehow the curriculum or the school is promoting homosexuality by saying this is something that an acceptable alternative, that children ought to be able to be comfortable with their classmates who come from homes where they're the parents of the same sex. And so any language like that, that often will bring up gay and lesbian issues around sex ed curriculums and so on. Another important reason is that people who are members of that community who work in the schools often do not feel that they are able to be out and supportive of their students, of their own personal belief that these are issues that are important because they feel the backlash of the right wing. Counselors and teachers are very vulnerable to right-wing parents who say, you're recruiting my kid, is basically what it comes down to. And so I think it's very important for the gay and lesbian community to be present in this fight and be supportive not only of the students that they may be helping, but the professionals, the teachers who are gays and lesbians and unable to be vocal in this arena. But I guess even more importantly, perhaps, is it's very much in the gay and lesbian community's self-interest to be involved in broader coalitions because we're fairly small in number and because we have such a huge political agenda that we're trying to achieve and that we cannot win without the support of our allies. And so the more times we can be involved with allied organizations and say, we're there for your issues, now come march with us in the Pride Parade. Show this community that you're open and accepting for all kinds of people. And we build those coalitions by joining in on these kinds of battles that have some of these overlapping issues.
And what kind of concerns might your constituents have?
How would your constituencies react to working with such queers?
So you're sorry, just clarification, you're asking me as an environmental thing or the challenge?
You can do whatever you want.
Okay. All right, I'll answer the environmental constituency. My experience is that there would be a great deal of uncomfortableness with that because I don't think that the environmental community have ever really reached out to the gay and lesbian community in any way, and that they see that there's any crossover issues, and I think that they would feel afraid because a lot more people accept gay and accept environmentalism or a clean environment than they do acceptance of gay and lesbians.
Anyone else want to respond, either as a member of Chris's organization here or representing the way in which Chris's organization getting involved would affect your own constituency's attitude?
If I were to respond as part of Chris's constituency, one of my concerns would be, here we are confronting an issue, and we tend to be the focus of people's anger. So by entering into it, are we going to, be throwing gas on a flame already?
So stay in the clouds where people can't focus their hatred on you.
Yeah. Or will we be creating more? Are we going to be solving problems and rendering support, or are we going to exacerbate something?
I think there's always that question of how much do you speak out, and for the gay and lesbian community, how much do you simply be out and be visible? And it's an internal conflict that many gay and lesbian people undergo. Should I just be quiet about this so as not to stir things up and so as not to bring wrath, potentially violence, certainly anger on myself? And that's a very personal question that I think individual gay and lesbian people have to answer for themselves. I think from the political standpoint, the more people that are willing to be out front and up present with who they are, the more minds we're going to change, the more politically we are going to be able to achieve our goals. Because, the research clearly shows that people who know gay and lesbian people are much more supportive of their right their rights in the political arena.
Probably if I were a member, the question I would have again would just be, what would we actually be doing? You know, how would we be spending our time, and what kind of opportunities would I have as the member to, choose in and out of that?
Yeah. And I would say to you as my member that, you certainly, I wouldn't ask you to do anything that you're not comfortable, yes, I would ask you to do something that you may not be comfortable with, but make it also clear that, that you get to make that decision personally, because I think it's always hard to put yourself in that way where you identify yourself as a despised minority in the eyes of the people who are making this attack. So I would try to give my members a lot of freedom to simply be a body at a gathering, or in this case, to go to the curriculum and the curriculum hearing and maybe not speak up, but you're there to support other people who are speaking up. To do some election work behind the scenes in a way that doesn't put you in any kind of sort of a public exposure position, but to be there to support members of your community who are needing to be in that position.
Should we just go down the?
Sure.
Okay.
Fine.
First of all, I would say as a feminist working in a women's organization, I would welcome being asked to join. Because often enough, I think some folks have the consideration of whether we should ask an out feminist, and I know it would be the same for Chris's organizations, to join us in the whole education discussion. Although I would say fundamentally, many of us got started in discussions around education with women's issues. If you remember back a number of years ago, Our Bodies Ourselves was one of the things that was first removed from schools in Montana. In fact, one of my favorite stories about our now Governor Roscoe is he was one of the people who actually said that Our Bodies Ourselves should not be put back into the Helena Public Library because it was so damaging for young people to read it. So I think women's experience has often been the experience that's been censored by folks that are trying to do something about curriculum or about libraries in the schools. So I think that this would be a fundamental women's issue, and that the organizations that I'm involved with would welcome to be asked to do it. But there's a couple of considerations we would have. One of them, and I'll bring it up just for you to reflect on, is many of us now have service contracts with the government, and as 501c3s, we have to be very thoughtful about the kinds of things that we get involved in. We can't get involved in political campaigns. We'd have to be very careful how we would encourage our members to be involved in certain kinds of lobbying activities. So as that kind of an organization, many of us have decided to think through how we get involved, what kinds of things we do, and also some of us have been associated in forming some other kinds of entities, like here in Missoula we have something that's called the New Party. And some of us that were part of the women's organization I'm a part of specifically got involved in starting that organization because it can do some things that we didn't feel we could do as a member of a 501c3 with large government contracts. So I'm answering a couple of levels. One is I think in general, the women's movement would be very interested in joining the coalition. They would just want to know how and what's the best way they could bring their resources to bear there. And then some people would be doing it as individuals, and some might be able to try to do it as organizations, and then forming other kinds of networks that could then bring that kind of support to the effort would probably be what we'd look at. And I would say overall, particularly this issue around the clinic, as you know, Blue Mountain here in Missoula was one of the clinics that was firebombed. And I think you'd have a lot of folks, if this had happened, very interested in seeing who these people were. They would have already identified them. They would already be very active in saying those are the same people, and they'd be out there very much bringing the pressure to bear on that set of people. Right. I don't know if my constituents would like to say.
Well, I would say, you mentioned the reproductive freedom part of the women's movement. And I guess if there's any part of the women's movement that seems single issue, it is NARAL, or people that are very focused. In fact, NARAL pushed on the Human Rights Network quite a bit to get us to adopt a platform on reproductive rights, and we did that. But they haven't countered with any kind of a gay rights platform. And I guess as a member who might have joined your group specifically because of choice issues, I could see how this would seem again like kind of a peripheral issue.
And again, I guess my response would be very much along the line that we've heard, which is these issues are so interlocked, and that if we are working on one, we have to be working on the other to actually accomplish what we want to. And I think Darrell is an interesting example, because I'm not sure I would claim it as part of the women's movement. In fact, I'd rather not. If there were folks, though, that were more from the women's movement with that kind of perspective, what I would simply say to them is, it's so obvious that the folks that are out here doing the curriculum are the same people that did actually do the clinic, and that when we respond, we ask the community to respond to the clinic, we ask everyone in the community to respond to us. And we ask them to become escorts, and we ask them to raise money to rebuild that building, and this is a part of our community that we would be giving back and involved with. That would be probably, to me, the easiest way to talk about that. But I would also like to talk about it from that whole idea that all progressive issues have to be worked on together. And then within some of the women's organizations that I'm a part of, in our mission statement, we do make a list. So we do have lists around the issues of gay and lesbians, around the environment, around building community. So those are all in our mission statements.
It's interesting that you brought this up, because in one of the Weave Women's Voices for the Earth newsletters a couple of years ago, when the legislature was in session, we had listed a number of important progressive pieces of legislation that were coming up, and just saying what those pieces of legislation were, so that just making our members aware that they were coming up. Again, as a 501c3, you're very limited on what you can do. But one of the things that happened was a couple of our members called up and were very angry because we had listed something to do with abortion. And we had one very strong Catholic member who objected to that. And we also had another woman who just said, pull us off your mailing list. I thought you were just going to be working on the environment. Mm-hmm. And again, I had that discussion with them about the fact is that you cannot just narrow your view down. But and it is a problem that how do you deal with people's religious views, like you are a strong Catholic. And what I have, my response to them, aside from saying that you've got to be able to work on these issues together, is that it's even more important is that people need to be informed.
And probably a little later we can talk more how we educate our membership, because I think that's partially what we're talking about. There's an ongoing education of your own membership.
I think what you need to remember is that even though we may have sort of a single issue track, none of our members are single issue. I mean, gay and lesbian people are environmentalists, they go to church, they're feminists. Environmentalists are also gays and lesbians. Some of them go to church. I mean, it's like all of our people, some of them. None of our people are single issue people, but yet we try to keep our organizing in these single issue tracks. I'm not in any role when I say that. I just want to say it.
I'm just trying to figure out what group I represent.
Every religious person.
Every religious person. if I represented every religious person, it's just hopeless. I mean, you would just say, well, there's no way. So I have to represent something a little more specific.
Representative, you get to say yes and no, both yes and no, and explain
Yeah.
this issue, right?
Yeah, particularly on this issue, because clearly, the opposition in this case is going to represent typically a lot of people who are very, very involved in communities of faith, who commonly today we tend to call the religious right. So I'm obviously not going to be the religious right. I'll represent the religious left, which some people say is an oxymoron, but it actually does exist. It is a well-kept secret. But there are many, many people involved in communities of faith that are deeply involved in progressive issues. So trying to discern exactly what orbit they are in together is difficult as well. And that might even be particularly more true in a community like Missoula, which isn't, one would think that we would have a very clear ecumenical or interfaith identity here. It really doesn't exist to the extent that one would think it would. And from what I can tell, it never really has. But let's say I'm representing I think the only thing I can do is sort of represent my church, which is kind of the token liberal church in town, along with a couple of others. And we always have been. And so I can imagine if this issue were to come along, and if somebody from an organization, sort of sifted through the remarkable ambiguity of communities of faith and contacted us, and I thought about it and talked to some other people, we would say, yeah, we want to be a part of this. And yet, how are we going to do that? What is the best way for this to happen? My experience has been organizing within religious communities is that you kind of do have a sense of what elements within the communities of faith would really respond to that. And you have to be fairly moxie about knowing who they are and the way to go about creating that connection. So I would, you know about what the other progressive churches might be in town. You sort of know who the people are who are involved with that. You would sit down and say, okay, here's the deal. We need to do this. One would think that through an organization such as the Missoula Ministerial Association, that would be a coherent approach to take. But, they tend not to be an advocacy group unless there's a real crisis that arises. And then they would kick in. So my response would be, yeah, let's do this. And I hope we can. And there's going to be a lot of dissension within religious communities because religious communities, what we're dealing with is ultimate belief and a sense of community. And that gets translated in a million different ways with a million different people. So what do you say to that?
Okay, I have a question for you. As a member of your constituency, I'm Clayrolling. I am really uncomfortable with, I happen to have some agreement with what these people are trying to do here because I think that there are a lot of people out there who are worshiping trees and worshiping mountains and rivers and scenery, and I think that they're getting a lot of this through Thoreau, and I'm not comfortable with my church challenging this.
You're not comfortable with you. Now, are you pretending you're a part of the church?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. It sort of sounded like my own people. Yeah. So you're not comfortable associating with people who are worshiping trees. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Well, I think the response would be, this is bigger than we are, and we need to focus on what this issue is. And there probably isn't a better example in the whole wide world of how disunity can happen than within the Christian community. We don't even know how many denominations there are. And the word that we use, the word ecumenical, comes from a Greek word called kumene, which means a house that's come together. And so we're talking about bringing people together here, not all of whom that we're necessarily going to agree with, but we're working for something that we know is right. And there is no such thing as guilt by association. If that were the case, none of us could get together.
So are you telling Bryony that tree worshipers are welcome in your church, and if she doesn't like it, she can find another church?
I'm saying, Bryony, we got a few of those already, so what difference is it? and there's a whole lot of room here. We don't tell people what they have to believe. And once we start laying down, strict orthodoxies, strict doctrines of, who's in and who's out, then we're losing out. And, it's time that we quit trying to be all things for all people. And we need to realize that not everybody in our community is going to be attracted to working on this issue. But there's a lot of people that are going to be deeply committed. And we need to work with other people who have that same goal in mind.
Brian, are you convinced or are you welcome?
I'm convinced, but I'll find another question.
I have another question too. As a member of your congregation, I might say, You know, I hear that there's a group of queers involved in this issue as well. And if we associate, I realize God loves queers too, but if we associate ourselves too closely with that particular political issue, we're going to lose people out of this congregation because we're going to start giving money and resources.
Yeah. And within communities of faith, you will not find a more controversial issue facing, at least within Christendom, the Christian church in America today than the whole thing of all the different issues of sexuality, including sexual orientation. Thankfully, there are pockets within the religious fabric that have dealt with the issue and have decided where they're at. And in the community that I'm a part of has done that. So if somebody would say that, I would say, well, 4 years ago we became an open and affirming church, and we've spoken on it. We have lost a lot of people, lost a lot of people that were really good to lose, and we took on a whole bunch more people, and you know, gay, lesbian folks are who we are, as well as being straight folks. So, yeah, there'll be people that are mad, but we're used to that.
Are we through with this, Barbara? Well, a lot of interesting themes came out of this, and I flagged a few to raise later if they don't come up, but we're really going to open this up at this point to all the rest of you, and we'll maybe a little bit of a kind of Donahue style format here. Paul told me that it had to be Jerry Springer, and I said, no way, I'm going there. But, you know, think about all these panelists said, for different reasons and some of the same reasons, yes, they were to get involved in this. And maybe a good question to throw out as a place to start is, do any folks in this audience who are identified with one or more of these kinds of organizations or constituencies disagree? And if so, on what basis? Karen?
Yeah, I'd like to frame the issue a little differently on environmentalism. I'd like to call it like self-interest. I mean, we don't maintain that the good Lord created. How are we going to live? Whether I believe in Thoreau and Gaidia, whatever, I'm Gaidia. Yeah, tree up 400 tree every time I put a tree tape around. Is that a 300? No. We define the issue. On the abortion issue, it isn't whether I believe that abortion is good or bad, or whatever. Is it whether the United States says that you have the right to practice that? That's not my issue. If I think it's wrong, I'm not the judge. It doesn't matter. And on the gay and lesbian issues, it's the same thing. Redefine the issue. Are we discriminating against those human beings by not including them and giving them the same rights that we have in the United States?
Other comments?
I've got a question. Are we still on the curriculum issue?
Yeah.
Okay, well, you know, will we feel comfortable putting Mein Kampf in, you know, in the curriculum here? I mean, is that cool?
Yeah.
Why not?
Well, isn't that so much as these are issues within issues that have to be solved if we're going to full issue?
Well, I still see it as the same thing. If we're correcting the
Yeah, it's part of the
curriculum
whole, it
for
is.
throwing that, you know, I mean, how, I guess what I'm asking is, how free are we? You know, I mean, would we have objections if those same parents, if, you know, the same group were objecting to that? Am I off base here or something?
No, I mean, I think, well, I think I think it's a little bit off the issue of what we're talking about here, because we're talking about why as progressives, we tend to work in pockets and not with each other. But to address what you're saying, I think it goes down to that basic question of freedom. and that noticing that whether it's the wise use movement or the religious right or whatever name you want to put to it, their main agenda is to challenge freedom, is to take away your freedom to choose whether you're gay or lesbian, whether you're an environmentalist, it doesn't matter what you are. It's taking away your right, your freedom, because they have a very specific agenda, and that's to make a bunch of money. And they'll manipulate. My perception is that they will manipulate the system to enhance that. And so it's a question of fundamental freedom. And you're right. And if you have, when you talk about freedom, it has to be a broad perspective. And that, you know, if you're going to include something like Mein Kampf in the curriculum to discuss it, I think it's healthy to discuss it. And you can point out, well, this is what this is about, just in the same perspective as you do, you know, if you talk about environmental issues or gay and lesbian rights issues. You have the ability for both sides to have discussion. And I'm not a parent, but if I were a parent, my perspective on bringing up a child would be the best thing that you can do for that child is to give them all perspectives and let them develop their own mind. And I think that that's critical in the curriculum. That's what education is.
In focusing on the question, though, of whether organizations should weigh in on this particular kind of fight is a concrete example, certainly not the only example that we can think of, but one that we can collectively discuss. Are there folks in the audience here, for instance, who are members of environmental organizations who would object if your organization were committing resources to a fight like this? I mean, just honestly, we want to tease it. There are obviously tensions in a situation like this. It's not necessarily like a right or wrong position on this. We really want to have some honest discussion about what those tensions look like. What are the dynamics that influence the decisions people make in these situations? There's a hand here.
Yeah.
The basic problem is when you're talking about your environmental group getting involved in it, your ersatz board members were split. Your ersatz board members were contesting why you should get involved with this. So the first thing you should do is go take a look at your mission statement. Are you getting involved with something that is within the bounds of your mission statement? And if you can't defend it within the bounds of your mission statement, you can't convince your board members to get involved. You've got dissension in your board. And how are you going to go to your fundraise when you have dissension in your board? I think you've got a real problem when some of your board members are not convinced, they don't want to go along with it, they think that there's going to be a problem in getting involved with this, they think you're off track with your mission statement, and as a member of an environmental group, I would have to be, it would take a lot more convincing for me to get involved in a topic like this, because I cannot defend it under my mission statement.
I got two answers to that. One is, I think, at a broader level, I think this is why the environmental movement is losing. And I really do believe we are losing. Because, and probably environmental movement, more than any other progressive issue, has such tunnel vision. You know, we somehow think that when we deal with logging or mining or water quality or any of these issues, that they somehow exist in some vacuum. But they don't. They exist in a much bigger, broader political perspective. And until, my feeling is that until the environmental community at a broader level starts to see that, we will continue to lose. And so then, yeah, go back and revisit your mission statement. And maybe the problem is with your exact mission statement. Maybe you need to look at your mission statement in the context of broad political change and where we want to go as environmentalists, as progressives. You know, what is our goal? And so I think that we should revisit some of our mission statements. I mean, my mission statement for my organization is to create an ecologically sustainable and socially just society. So bang, it fits right in with my mission statement. But, and it was chosen specifically for that reason, because we looked at what other environmental groups were doing and why we felt that they were losing ground. Then my other perspective is, if even within your own board, even if it doesn't fit your mission statement, or even if you can't see those clear connections, you need to be having a discussion with your board about how strategy of how you get to whatever it is the goal is in your particular mission statement. And, I mean, one of the things, whenever I go to an environmental rally, whatever, I look around and it's the same people. Time and time again, I go to an environmental conference, it's the same people. And it's like, why do we even waste our time? Because we're just preaching to the converted. But we are always trying to figure out other ways that we can get other people to come in and be a part of the environmental movement. But it's not going to ever happen until the environmental movement is part of the broader progressive agenda. I love Jim Hightower's expression. Organizing progressive is like loading a bunch of frogs into a wheelbarrow. And that is really, I just love that because it's exactly what the problem is. It's like loading a bunch of frogs into a wheelbarrow. You get one on the other side. And I think that the environmental movement has really got to make some changes. And as far as funders go, I've been talking to funders a lot about this issue, and a lot of them agree, are frustrated with their own people that they fund because they don't see the broad picture.
Let's get a couple more comments out before we have panel responses. So I hand here, there was a handout here, and we'll go from there.
One of the things that we've heard, and maybe this is endemic to youth, but we speak out on social justice issues of all types, not just environmental issues. We came under criticism last summer from the Democrats saying, you folks speak out on everything, therefore you don't have credibility, you are just all over the lot. So until others get more involved and have a mission statement personally, such as Bryony's, I don't know how this can work. I mean, it's another way to put you down. You say you try to keep you down, keep you from speaking out.
I guess getting back to the comment over here, at some point though, the loss becomes unacceptable. If you take a position, this goes back to mission statement. If you, as the quote-unquote administration of an organization, take a position and you lose 10% of your members because of that, and it is something that's on the edges or over the edge of what your mission statement and their understanding what they joined was, is that acceptable? 20% acceptable? 30% acceptable? At some point, anybody's going to decide that the liability of engaging this is so large that we simply can't do it. And related is the foundation and membership support issue, but particularly the foundation support issue. If your funders, for example, the Bullitt Foundation, if they're funding the Montana Human Rights Network and we all of a sudden move into North Dakota, they have a problem with that and they're no longer going to fund us. If we move into an issue area that they aren't supportive of, I mean, those are real considerations, and I guess my concern is that on a theoretical plane, and obviously we're very big boosters of it, it's got to be, we've got to have a bigger progressive vision and we've got to unite around that vision. But on the ground, we run into this organizational imperative a lot. And I guess I'm interested in people's maybe gradations of where does it become unacceptable? I mean, and which begs the whole question of democratic process. I mean, if you're really going to jump outside the mission, you got boards, you got membership, and going through all of that.
There's a hand back here, gentleman, that look out.
Yeah, and this follows some on Bryony, and it doesn't really respond directly to Ken, but I think indirectly. It's sort of easy to say, coalitions are good. I think what's really at stake here is a strategic question, and it's a decision that folks on the left are trying to puzzle out and have been for some years. And I'll put it sharply. I think we all have to decide whether it is possible for us to succeed at any kind of meaningful goal, or even at defending ourselves from the right, without seriously becoming institutionally unified with others and other causes and groups, and beginning to play at a higher level of the political influence, power, government game. For some of us, we've met, we've got a group together, we got continuing funding, we're doing some lobbying. So my question translates, can you succeed You know, is this effort justifiable if you can't think about, you know, electing a congressman, you know, within 10 years, 15 years? Is it, you know, or you know, I'm saying that's the question that has to be addressed. And it's not necessarily congressman, it could be city councilman, it could be, depending on where you're at. I'm saying, can you win without moving up a level in terms of influence, power, politics, organization? And I think that's the question that we're not answering frequently, because it's convenient and comfortable to stay where you are and to do what you've done and try and fend off the bad guys from the one perch that you have.
Maybe take one more question or comment, and let's try to keep these a little bit tighter. Eli?
Yeah, I just want to say, speaking from the perspective of a so-called radical environmentalist, I don't want to get hung up on semantics here, but you know, one of the fundamental underpinnings of the environmental movement is biodiversity. That includes human diversity. When any kind of diversity is threatened, it is our problem. Anybody who thinks that homosexuality is restricted to human beings doesn't know much about the biotic community at large. You know, that's just one example.
Responses to some of these concerns.
One of the thoughts I had is in terms of the whole mission statement thing. When we create organizations, be they secular, sacred, or whatever, there's really a tendency as time rolls on for rigidity to replace flexibility. Our organizations constantly, I think, have to be engaged in a process of reformation. Think of the organizations you've been a part of and what's happened when you've gone beyond the boundaries that the organization typically has set for itself. Amazing things happen. Oftentimes there's death to an organization when it happens, but it creates a new catalyst for growth too. And we tend to get awfully calcified, I think, in our organizations. You know, clearly, when I, you know, looked at the table and imagined myself to be in a more conservative religious context than I am, you know, I think, oh Lord, you know, you couldn't associate with any of them because it just doesn't work. But I'm not in that. It's different. How do you build bridges instead of creating walls? I think a part of that is really not worshiping the organizations that we're a part of, but rather seeing them for what they are, the organizations. And if we're not working together on these larger goals, that represents a significant failure on the part of not just the organizations, but all of our spirits.
Peter, can I just press you on this a little bit, maybe in light of some of the comments that came up? You had suggested in your remarks, I thought it was very intriguing earlier, that sometimes you lose people when you do the right thing, as you put it in an organization, that are worth losing. And sometimes that may be true. That you should assume that an organization is a static collection of individuals, and you may gain some people if you take on an issue who aren't then currently with you. So you've been talking about this level of flux. Ken, however, raised a very sort of pointed question about, well, but are there limits? Is there a point that goes too far? How much is worth losing? Is it worth pushing an organization to the point of inevitable or likely collapse or failure to do something that seems morally right? How do you tease out a complicated?
Well, I mean, part of the weird thing is that I work with an organization that's, you know, 2,000 years old. And you know, it's always in the midst of change, but you know that, you know, because it is sort of vision-based, it's going to go on, so that's different. But yeah, in my experience, being a part of a sort of a historic, progressive, mainline denomination, we've been in numerical decline now for 32 years. How many organizations can be in numerical decline for 32 years while still being there? So we're kind of used to that. One of the reasons I really feel we're in decline is that we tried to be all things for all people, and we didn't want to offend anybody. And I think we're really starting to learn to say, you know, what is our distinctive voice? You confront a curriculum committee like this, well, I know our people are against this stuff. Let's not pretend we're not. There will be some who won't like that, who might not like what this conservative curriculum committee is trying to do, but they just don't like the idea of confronting anybody on anything controversial. And my experience has been organizationally, when you do something bold, it brings more people in. But man, it sure changes the organization. You know, my image is when, particularly with the gay lesbian issue, when we made our proclamation, it was like the bus stopped and a lot of people got off the bus. Then the bus started moving again. And now it's getting filled with all kinds of people. And a lot more than there was before. But it is real risky. But does it feel faithful? I mean, is it the right thing to do? Are you guided by your principles? Or are you guided by organizational fears?
Other panelists, response to any of the things that have come up.
Go ahead. Again, in real sort of different perspective here, starting organizations that have been around for a much less period of time.
Although women have been around.
That's true. Organizations have a particular relationship with us. I think that's a question that is out there to me that I would answer, but in the sense that what Ken was saying is that in some ways, starting something fairly recently, bringing to it this idea that the mission should really reflect more of the concerns than just a strict, what might be considered women's issue, but also environment and community building and all of those things. That is something that we very consciously did, that we said we want to create something new because we feel we are in a new political time. And the interesting thing from our point of view is that our funders are very positive about that. So that, for example, the Ms. Foundation has definitely come forward saying we want to support organizations that are moving out into taking in some of these other questions and not seeing a limitation on what they're going to do. And we get a significant amount of money from the Northwest Area Foundation, who also is saying we want to see the work that you're doing in community sustainability, and the fact that you also have all of these basic women's issues as sides of what you do is fine, because it shows that you're this kind of rounded organization and that you're interested in reaching out and doing different things. So I guess what I'm saying is that some of you that are in more traditional organizations may need to ask that question about what you do with that more limited mission or funding situation. For some of us who've chosen to actually start something fairly new with these new possibilities, I see a very open future, and I see great possibility. But what Ken mentioned is the thing that a lot of us feel is that you shouldn't go into someone else's territory, like going into North Dakota might be a really different situation. So that would be the thing you'd have to have discussion with folks and see what it might mean. But if you start moving into an area, that whole collaboration issue becomes something, again, that comes up. So I would say for our organizations, the things that I'm aware of, we're moving forward with a very broad mission. And if we see a place where someone is already working, we're going to offer them this collaboration and ask them what it is that we can do, what makes sense to work together. And so far, anyway, that's worked very well. I think that we're being quite successful at that model of work. And I would offer it out as something for you to consider. But I do think one of the things I mentioned before that we do regularly is we do educate the folks that are in our organization about other people's issues. So it isn't something that's just sitting out waiting to happen so that they wouldn't understand why we wanted to deal with the environment. Some of us have been really involved with the school board campaign here recently, and we invited other people in our organization to be aware of that and understand that all along throughout the process. So it didn't come just to the day of the vote, but we said, well, be sure to go out and vote. So I think that's another commitment that you have to make as an organization, is to say, if we really believe in this multi-issue integration, then our members have to be brought along and educated on a very regular basis to all of these different issues.
There's a couple things that came to mind. And one has to do with, I do think groups need to have a focus. I don't think all of our groups should look exactly the same, that Peter's group looks the same as my group, looks the same as Brian's group, so that people don't have a sense of that there's a mission or a focus at all. But I think the key is that you approach your work with a broader understanding of things, and that you bring that understanding to bear. And so you're willing to educate your members on a variety of things. You're willing to say, there's a school board thing going on, it's important to our organization for this reason, and maybe you don't assign 3 paid staff people to go do a whole bunch of work, but you get some volunteers to say, why don't you go check in with this People For group, find out how you can help and bring some folks along, and feel free to mention that Weave or Pride or whatever group is, that you're coming there for that organization, so that there is communication that your group is involved in this. And then one other point I wanted to make, when Peter said that he attributes the longevity of his institution to the fact that it's a vision and values-based institution, I think we should pay some attention there. The environmental movement certainly is a vision and values-based movement as well, but I think we end up not communicating that very effectively, that we don't really talk a lot about the values that bring us to the work that we do, and that we would have more appeal and would bring in more members if we talked more about the values that bind us together, and that the vision that we have for the future.
In response to your comment, Mary Kay, about, oh, well, you're not an expert on any one thing because you work on all these other things. It's certainly a criticism that we've had. I don't know if you want to tell that story. Do you want me to tell it?
You may.
Okay. One of the, when we started Women's Voices for the Earth, we got some backlash within the rest of the environmental community for saying, oh, women's what? Yeah, women's environmental organization, what's the deal? Anyway, and so we were dealing with some of the backlash, and part of it was some people in the community started calling us women's voices for everything, thinking that it was an insult. And we were thrilled to be this, because we were saying, that's it. That's the whole reason. And so my response to people with that is that, yeah, if there's an injustice anywhere, my head is going to pop up and to deal with it. And as Chris said, is you want to be goal-oriented, but you do have to have this broader vision and values thing that you come in and say, yes, I'm on this path, but as stuff comes in from the side, I'm going to be there to defend it, because after all, we are all going in the same direction. And I think that, particularly with the environmental movement, where we've been particularly susceptible to the far right, is the fact that we have this vision of protecting the environment and not looking at the complications in particular issues. For instance, when we are working on a particular issue that could create job loss, we don't address that job loss. We just stay, when I say we, I mean, I'm talking about some people in the environmental community. They're just looking at what's happening on that particular environmental issue. And I agree with Tarso that we need to be saying, yes, that's our goal, but the fact is we do have a community that's going to be impacted.
Works a little different, we certainly would support those folks, although the meeting would probably last so long that
We're not gonna pick that one up. So the next round of questions, and we're going to start with the panel real quickly, and then I think open it up to a broader discussion, is what are your various organizations, institutions have all said, yes, you're going to weigh in on this fight. So that kind of question of whether is settled in this scenario. And the next question is sort of how, and what strategies would you offer so that it is a successful campaign?
Why don't you start with someone else?
How about you, Chris?
Okay. I'm going to speak somewhat particularly to, again, the queer community and what I think we could offer to this kind of a situation. Letters to the Editor campaigns are clearly something that would need to happen. I mean, you've got something immediate. You have a meeting coming up in 4 weeks. You have an election in 6 weeks. And you can be anonymous in Letters to the Editor, fairly anonymous. You can have somebody else sign the letter that you write. You can write or you can sign some letter that somebody else wrote. You don't have to be entirely out there. So I would think that gay and lesbian community could be persuaded to join, hopefully, a Letter to the Editor campaign that would be crucial in this kind of thing, so that the facts of this case are out there in Letters to the Editor, and that you begin to develop sort of a public opinion kind of swell around that. Yeah, at the risk, I guess, of sounding a little stereotypical, I think that one of the things gay and lesbian community particularly brings is a gift of sort of celebration and theater and music, and not that other people don't bring those same things, but I think this is an area where you can engage the gay and lesbian community. One of the more powerful experiences for me recently was the gay and lesbian community did a production of the stories of gay and lesbian lives in Montana. There were storytelling circles in 4 or 5 communities around the state. Gay and lesbian people got together, told their stories, they were recorded, they are actually filed in the archives of the library as oral history at this point. But a production was made from that, and one of the most powerful pieces in the production was a man from the environmental movement. He had been active as staff member, president of the MWA for quite a long time, a very active environmentalist who is also a gay man. And he told the story of what wilderness meant to him during this production. And it was the most moving piece that you can imagine. I wish you had all been able to see it, and I still wish we could put Lou on the road and take that story around to the environmental community, to listen to what his voice says about the intersection of these 2 issues and what it's meant in his life. So I think there could be some community education involving those kinds of creative issues. Another thing I think that gay and lesbian community might particularly bring in is youth. You know, all the issues around sexuality and gender identity and those things are big topics in the high school population. And I think you would certainly want high school students brought into this discussion and speaking at these school board meetings. And I think that a gay and lesbian community could do a lot to help bring and organize a youth contingent to speak up at these curriculum meetings. And I think that would be particularly powerful to have youth voices at these meetings. I'll offer those suggestions.
I think on a tactical level, when you're putting coalitions together, there's a lot to be said for being honest about the distrust that is there. To be able to really lift up the differences so that eventually they might be able to be set aside. But if you don't go through that process first, it's going to come up later. There's a lot to be said for that beginning time of saying we are different. Historically, you know, these various different groups represent differing constituencies with differing priorities. We all speak our own language. How can we start doing some translating so that we can talk the same way for the amount of time and for the issue that we need to do that with? I guess it's just sort of recognizing the tribalism that we're all a part of, and all of us really are. And if you're going to work with different people in different groups, there's a lot to be said for doing some things at the beginning that creates some basic understandings. Because I just see it happen time after time, that unless that work goes on, it's going to come back and rear its ugly head at some point.
And Peter, what do you think that the religious, or your congregation, and by extension perhaps others with which you have relationships, what in particular do you think that you would have to offer in this struggle, in this campaign?
Well, you know, hopefully in the faith communities we know something about reconciliation and that sort of thing, and bringing some of those to bear, knowing that the language that we possess is oftentimes, you know, it's not an appreciated language, actually, the majority of our culture, particularly in a place like Western Montana. And so you have to be careful. But, you know, dealing with notions of peace and reconciliation it's a big deal. And, you know, hopefully every group brings something to bear with that. But, boy, if you can't kind of look at these differences and recognize them and be real, I don't know how you can create a sense of unity.
Peter, I just wanted to ask the language of the other side, given the other activities they've been involved in, is likely to be religious language. Yeah. And do you think there's a particular role for the religious left to play in countering the God talk from the religious right?
I think there's a huge role. But one of the things that's, yeah, I mean, it's like the Hightower thing. You know, it's difficult to get progressive people together, and frankly, progressive people tend not to go to progressive churches. It's just the way it works. And that's a real problem. So we're not numerically necessarily all that large, although we're larger than people think. But we tend to be afraid of using God language because it's been co-opted by the religious right. There's a lot of language that gets co-opted. And there's a lot of people now that are saying, we've got to take back our language. And we've got to be who we are.
Trudy, what about the women's committee?
Well, I was going to say a couple of things about timing, because given that we have elections and various things within 4 to 6 weeks, what I would hope is, as I said before, we would have had some information already, and people would have had some understanding of some of the issues. So what we could do is offer to activate lists of people, and we'd have folks that could do things that these particular committees wanted to have happen. One of the things that would occur to me right away is to say to folks that are on this committee, what is it that we can really provide for you if they're at that stage of ready to be asked. So, you know, if it is bodies or phone, a lot of times we offer our phones to be used because we have extra phones like in our offices and things like that. If they don't really know what they need, one of the things we could say is we can offer some organizing expertise because some of us have this. We could be resource people if that's something you want. But I guess given the amount of time here, I would be particularly interested in trying to find out what folks already know how to do and what it is that we could help them do. And one of the things about a lot of the folks that we work with is they are parents. A lot of them are moms, often enough single moms with kids that are really interested in getting into the schools and actually taking the other side of the more visible discussion that you're talking about, Chris, is being very visible about saying, I'm a parent and I want to see what the school is doing here with my kids' education and I don't want censorship. So I think we could turn out certainly folks from that perspective. So my view would be to see what they need and what we can offer, and if possible, for the longer term, start talking about, okay, what kind of organizing resources do you need and can we help with those?
And then finally, Brian.
Well, I think what we would do, also given the limited time factor, is that our organization would offer to go and talk to the broader environmental community, to go to their specific meetings and talk to them about why it would be important for them to get involved in this issue, even at a very sort of surface level, even if they were simply writing a letter on organizational letterhead to the school board saying that even though we are an environmental group, we recognize the First Amendment right here, and that we too think that this whole curriculum issue should be left open.
Okay. I'm gonna, we're running it just a little bit long, and so what I want to propose to do, we have one last sort of question, and I want to ask each one of the panelists to address it in sort of 30 seconds, and then each of them will just blow it open for the final open discussion. And a couple of you, several of you perhaps even in your remarks initially around why you would get involved, mentioned that a particular goal, an asset of getting involved, would be the kind of relationship building with other constituencies. Not the only reason, but an important reason to consider in getting involved in this fight, the opportunity to build relationships. Well, given that, would you keep this coalition alive after the 6 weeks is up, after the sort of short-term immediate deadlines are over? Would you keep it going? And if so, with what kind of structure?
I personally wouldn't put energy into keep it going because that's the time when I think that the energy can be taken away from the organization. However, I would hope that I would have built some of those relationships and say, oh gosh, Peter, I never thought about talking to your constituency about our environmental issues. How would you feel about us coming in and talking, if you have an environmental committee, or could we come in and talk to the congregation, or what ways are there we can develop it? And that's why I keep those relationships alive.
I agree, you'd want to try to keep the channels of communication open. I think that the models we have right now for coalition groups in terms of, you get all these groups that were involved in this fight, okay, let's just get together once a month, you send your representatives, you send your representatives. I think that's still set up to sort of keep us in our issue areas, and that we need to hold on to the idea of talking to each other. And I guess I don't know what a good structure is. I think that we need to be thinking about that, though. How do we keep communications open without draining off into sort of forming a whole nother organization that is trying to represent everything. And there's one model on the right that I would point to, and that is the Christian Coalition. I mean, no matter, they're an organization that is a group. They have their own board of directors. They aren't really a coalition in the sense that they have people from lots of different organizations representing an organization on their board of directors. But if we look at that model, maybe what we need is a group that just agrees that they're going to work on the progressive issue of the day. You know, the thing that's hot and that really needs to be worked, and then that group draws the coalition together for the issue at hand. And maybe that's a model that might work better than saying, okay, these 8 groups are going to have a representative at the table and we'll fight it out each time an issue comes up and decide whether it's important or not. I don't know, it's an idea.
Well, I agree. I think as an organization, I wouldn't want to take on a commitment to say that we'll stay involved with this coalition long-term. Just from this interaction we've had so far, I would want to have the networks open and continue communication. I think, though, also that, as I mentioned before, I would really encourage people to take a look at something like the New Party chapter here in Missoula and say, this is a group that's been set up very specifically to deal with issues and with elections, and your issue is important to us, and invite you to come in and meet, and invite some of our outreach people to come address your groups, etc. So I would be open to it, but I wouldn't put the energy from my organization into actually making the coalition continue.
And I'd say clearly the coalition has to end in a specified amount of time, with the knowledge that the cooperation has to go on forever.
Okay, with that, we want to open this up to responses or questions about any of this, sort of the 2 general areas that we just tried to cover were, one, sort of strategy and what particular strengths each constituency would bring to a fight like this, and then secondly, the question of the nature of the relationships between them once the thing comes to an end, whether to continue the coalition, continue some kind of networking. Chris sort of challenging us to think about the need perhaps for a multi-issue progressive organization that picks up the things that I think are the key hot issues of the day, as opposed to having to kind of cobble together a permanent coalition or a coalition every time one of these things comes up. Responses to any of that stuff? I know you're in a windowless room, you've been here a long time, it's like the casino, you don't know what time it is, it could be 3 in the morning, it could be hailing outside, you have no idea, you're disoriented, but you know, we're in the home stretch here.
Maybe if there was like some fundamentals that everyone agreed to come together with them. For example, I think the Western Organization Resource Councils saying, is it a winnable issue? So that you have these kinds of different things that you weigh a new issue by to see if you're going to come together again and do another similar activity.
Is this new sensibility about the need for coalitions and the need to have broader mission statements part of the new thinking that's going through progressive organizations? Is this information being disseminated? Is this part of, because it seemed like the thinking years ago was you have to be authentic, you have to be focused on your community and down there, you know, with the grassroots, and not get involved in all of this, you know, vision thing. Is this the new thinking? Is this kind of where it's headed to? Because if it is, that's good. And of course, what we're really talking about is organizations changing to a certain extent on the margins, you know, and loosening up a little bit on this issue of single issue points of view. So that's a question. I don't know.
Any responses to that?
I have one. I mean, I'm hearing precious little of this kind of, I mean, the response that I hear is we define our issue, we focus it narrowly, we pull as many people around that as we can, carefully not offending them on any other issues, to get as many people together to carry the day. I think that is a very dominant philosophy that goes through all of our institutions, from the advocacy groups to think tanks such as they are, to foundations, that the progressive movement is shot through with exactly what you're talking about. So, and I'm hearing, there's some discussion, of course, and there's a lot of discussion about philosophy of a more broad-based coalitions, but it's usually, I hear it in terms of coalitions of these fairly constrained organizations coming together for specific purposes. I want to pick up on what Judy said, that, and I should qualify this and say I'm on the State Democratic Party e-board, and there are certainly tensions between New Party and the Democratic Party, but to me this is exactly what political parties should be doing. They really ought to be the home where these broader things come together in a unified front. I think clearly that's collapsed, at least in Montana. It's sure not working that way. So to me, we do have some institutional structures around that are intended to be multi-issue advocacy organizations, but I really think that a lot of progressivism is constrained by exactly the model we put forward, this narrow definition of broad constituency around it.
I have a quick response. I think that the tendency is still very much what Ken is describing overall, although there is a lot of new discussion about the extent to which, sort of the narrow focus of issue organizations is creating incredible vulnerabilities. In a time of growing strength on the political right, the narrow issue focus is translated into political isolation and facilitated kind of divide and conquer strategies. And so I think there is more discussion. I'm not sure how much movement there is in response to that, but there is more discussion about the fact that we use terms like movement, but it would be very difficult to identify anything in this country that you would refer to as a progressive movement in the sense of a social movement that you can identify, that's in the streets, that people know is going on, you can't avoid because it's there. I mean, I don't think that we can point to anything really, or not much in any case. And so I think that there is an increasing amount of discussion about, okay, if that's the goal, if the goal is movement, is the work the way that we're doing it now, can it possibly get us to that? Can it possibly get us to that place? And I am hearing more discussion of the sort that Chris is putting out about the need of developing multi-issue organizations. I think there is more interest in the idea of a cross-constituency kind of education and organizing. And, to some degree, my institution is committed, for instance, to all the work that we do happening in a multi-constituency context, because even if you're not forcing people to work on the same issues, at least people are informed by that kind of context. So there are a lot of different sort of, I think, ways to approach this, and there's some fits and starts, but I think that we're a long way from having anything approaching a consensus on it. But there's fervent.
Let me just follow up, because the experience in Montana is kind of moving the exact opposite direction. I mean, the recent, those of you who are familiar, the big, oldest progressive coalition in Montana has faltered, let's say. It has not died, but it's faltered. Moncel and Matt in Helena. And the interesting thing about it, and the only reason I'm going to hog more time on this, is that I think there's a lot more discussion, but a lot of the reaction to the pressure from the right is, I think that groups are going back into a more narrow focus, revisiting that exact originating philosophy, and kind of entrenching themselves in being more hesitant to reach out on a multi-issue thing because they perceive risk there. And so what we're seeing, and I think what should be a great concern to all of us in this room, is I think people are recognizing the need for multi-issue work, recognizing the need for coalitions, but when they're getting on the ground and getting their teeth kicked in, generally their reaction is to kind of duck and cover and get back to what's close and safe.
One other thought, and it kind of ties in with that, we created an overnight new organization in Butte to try to get a good cleanup of Silver Bowl Creek under the Superfund cleanup. We created a group called Citizens for Labor and Environmental Justice. So suddenly we had the truck drivers in the pit sending forms that we sent out from the Citizens Committee to Helena, to DEQ, saying we want those truck driving jobs to take the tailings out of the creek and put them up behind the Berkeley pit. So we got an astounding number of those went into DEQ, and it had a big impact on getting a good record of decision. The group has gone away again. We may revive it again. But maybe that's a way to come together into a coalition that isn't risky for any particular group, but to create a new organization where people can come in and do the job and then back off again.
Other comments, ideas, responses, stuff? Well, I just want to say that, well, first of all, thank all the panelists, but also to point out that this particular example has a lot of, people were teasing out, has a lot of elements drawn from actual experience. And just in terms of my own work dealing with the anti-environmental lobby, the wise use backlash, this kind of focus on transcendentalism and New Age and environmentalism as paganism is actually a growing emphasis. I made some remarks about that the other night, as did Daniel Berry in his presentation this morning. As is the attack on environmental education. I honestly didn't track what happened in the Montana legislature, but we had bills attacking environmental education in most of the states in the West, heated fights over them in several places, at the same time that, at least in some states, we're seeing an increasing level of sort of corporatization in the schools and sort of corporate messages getting in. And so this is not sort of an abstract kind of question for the environmental movement. We are seeing these kind of curriculum fights emerging in different places, and some very peculiar alliances being born from those, where we see chapters of groups like People for the West, which is now changed its name, but People for the West, together with groups like Citizens for Excellence in Education, working together to try to defeat, Goals 2000 and outcomes-based education. So these kinds of things are in fact happening, and so I think there is a kind of direct threat, and not just an indirect threat. And much of this is the environmental movement. I just thought I would tease that out a little bit. But let's have a round of applause for our panelists.